Yeah, my name's Sinyangwe, co-founder of Campaign Zero and Mapping Police Violence. And today I'm going to talk about how we can use data and digital activism to effectively fight to end systemic racism and police violence in America. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work over the past several years in that space. So my work really began on August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown Jr. was shot and killed in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. His death sparked protests starting in Ferguson and reverberating across the country that led to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which really has sustained to this day. Just for a little bit of context, the year since Mike Brown was killed, we saw 4 times as many protests as were recorded at the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 1965. In those early days and weeks and months following Mike Brown's death, the national conversation on policing really was held up on this question of whether police violence was a series of isolated incidents or a broader systemic issue. While communities had experienced this for a long time and were saying that this was systemic and that there was racial bias involved, in many ways, when that conversation was happening in the media, it was stopped by this question of where's the data? Where is the data? And the question kept being asked because the federal government does not collect comprehensive data on the number of people killed by police in the United States. And so every time that conversation happened, it was literally shut down by this question of, well, we just need the data. At the time, I was a policy analyst working at an Oakland nonprofit, and I looked at these 2 databases which were profiled at 538.com. 538 had this amazing article where they said, the federal government doesn't collect the data. However, there are these 2 crowdsourced databases out there, literally just spreadsheets, where somebody every single day would wake up, have a sophisticated system of Google alerts, and according to certain keywords like officer-involved shooting, police killing, and they would log every day the police killings that were reported online. Those databases were audited and found to be 100% accurate. And between the 2 of them, they had about 1,200 people killed by police a year. Now, according to best research estimates, that's about 99% of the total number of people killed by police in this country. So in essence, the data was there all along. It's just that nobody was making sense of it. Nobody was analyzing it. Nobody was using it to add value to the conversation. And so that's the work that I did. So I took those 2 databases, merged them together, filled in the gaps, searched through obituaries, public records, criminal records databases, social media profiles of the people who had been killed to identify the race of the people, whether they were armed or unarmed, additional details about the circumstances of the incident, the police department responsible, etc. And then we launched this site. So I connected with activists on the ground in Ferguson, protest leaders, and together we launched mappingpoliceviolence.org. And what this map shows are 314 Black people killed by police in the year 2014. So as the country, many people were familiar with Tamir Rice and Mike Brown. At that point, people were familiar with Walter Scott. But nobody was really thinking that it was at this scale, that there were literally over 300 Black people killed by police every year, 1,200 people total. That's more than 3 people every day killed by police in the United States. But we didn't stop there. So we launched the map really to show people the scale of this issue, that indeed this is a crisis that's not limited to St. Louis, that's not limited to Baltimore, but in fact is something that's happening all across this country. But we wanted to dive deeper into those numbers, right? How can we effectively use data to add value to the conversation about what's going on and to push that conversation forward so that we can talk about solutions and empower communities to actually implement those solutions in their communities? And so here are a couple findings that we found at first, and then I'm going to talk about how we use this data effectively in partnership with community. First, we found that police killings rates were fairly steady year over year. So this didn't start in 2014. In fact, there are about between 1,100 and 1,200 people killed by police every single year between 2013 and 2016. Already this year, 411 people have been killed by police since May 1st. We wanted to answer questions about accountability. So how often are officers indicted following these incidents? What we found was that it's extremely rare. So only in about 2% of incidents, officers are actually charged with a crime. And when you actually look at conviction rates, it's even lower. So in our entire database, we have over 5,000 incidents in our database. Less than 0.1% of those cases resulted in an officer being convicted of a crime. 0.1%, so 99.9% of the time that a police officer kills somebody, they're not convicted of a crime. We wanted to look at racial disparities. So first of all, we wanted to answer this question, is there racial bias in policing, particularly against black communities? What we found was that black people were 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people in the United States. And you can see there that the red bar is the rate for black folks. It far outstrips even other people of color. Black folks were also more likely to be unarmed when killed by police. So in 2015, 30% of black folks killed by police were confirmed unarmed. Then we wanted to break it down by place, right? So what we found was that police violence varies significantly depending on where you are. It varies by state, it varies by police department. And so what you see here, we took the 100 largest cities in America, and we looked at the rates per capita of police-involved killings. And what you see is that cities like Orlando, Florida, St. Louis, Baltimore, Oklahoma, Stockton, Bakersfield have rates that are really off the charts. To give you a sense of what that means, black men in many of these cities are killed by police at a rate higher than the US murder rate. Whereas there are other cities at the bottom of the scale, places like New York City and Buffalo, New York, that have rates that are much lower. And actually 3 of the 100 largest police departments did not kill anybody since 2013. On the right, you can actually see unarmed folks killed by police, and it's colored by the race of the person killed. And so what you see here is that almost every unarmed person killed by police in America's major cities is a person of color, and the majority are black people. So that's one thing, right? Data that helps people understand the scale of the problem. We're also using data to effectively counter some of the narratives that have emerged to attempt to justify these killings. So in the beginning stages of the movement, the challenge really was, how do we convince the country that there's a crisis going on, that there is a crisis not just in St. Louis, but there's a crisis in your own community that you need to be involved in addressing. As that became clear and more people were acknowledging there was a crisis, many folks within policing, folks on the conservative end of the spectrum, were using narratives to attempt to justify these killings. They were saying, yes, police are killing people at extraordinary rates. However, it's because of, as they would say, crime, right? And in particular, they would say black-on-black crime. Now, they wouldn't bring data to those conversations, so we did. What we found was we compared rates of crime. Here you can see the chart for the 60 largest cities, rates of police-involved killings and rates of crime. So the red squares are rates of police-involved killings, and the blue X's are rates of violent crime. And so what you can see here is that there is no correlation between the level of crime in cities and the level of police violence, right? So you have cities that have extremely high levels of crime, places like Detroit and Newark, New Jersey, that have very low levels of police-involved killings. By contrast, as I said, the city with the highest rate of police-involved killings is Orlando, Florida, which has a far lower crime rate than places like Baltimore or Detroit. We also want to explain this variation. If it's not crime, what explains it, right? There are cities here like Orlando, Florida, and Buffalo, New York, when you contrast them, actually have very similar populations, similar demographics, similar crime rates, vastly different rates of police violence. And so we looked into why that was the case. We looked at the policies of police departments. We looked at the best research and practice in terms of policing. We looked at the demands from protest groups across the country, and we synthesized those into a policy agenda called Campaign Zero. Campaign Zero has 10 policy categories to end police violence in the United States. It involves things like empowered community oversight, obviously demilitarizing the police, accountable police union contracts. So a big issue that doesn't get a lot of play is that police union contracts actually have many different provisions in them that make it harder to investigate and hold officers accountable. Things that, for example, erase the officers' disciplinary records, that allow officers to be reinstated after they've been fired by appealing to an arbiter. As well as other things like independent investigations and prosecutions, use of force policies that are more restrictive on how and when police use force, training, and other areas. So to think about how data plays a role in getting to solutions, one of the things we looked at was why were these incidents occurring in terms of the initial reason for that engagement. So what we found was that, in fact, for many of these cases, about 15% of these cases involved a alleged crime that was considered what we call a broken windows offense. So these are things like possession of marijuana, loitering, trespassing, open container of alcohol, that actually were resulting in about 15% of of the total number of people being killed by police. And so what we've said is actually, can we actually invest in alternative responses to those types of behaviors? So things like mental health providers and social workers being first responders to many of these cases. And you actually see in places like LA's mental health evaluation unit that is actually a solution that is being implemented effectively. So that's how that sort of makes it into the recommendation. What we also found was that many of these cases, about 8%, actually resulted from a traffic infraction. These are things where officers thought that they stopped a vehicle. The vehicle was alleged to have driven towards the officer, and so the officer fired on that person. In fact, just yesterday, a case came out in Texas of a 15-year-old black boy who was killed by police. The police officer saying that they drove towards the officer, and so he fired. What we found was that many police departments actually prohibit officers from doing that. About 15% of police departments prohibit officers from firing on a moving vehicle unless somebody within that vehicle is firing on the officer. But again, that's only 15% of departments. In those departments, the rates of police-involved killings are much lower. So that's how, for example, that recommendation made it into the limit use of force section. So we have a policy agenda. It's only as good as it is being advocated for effectively and implemented at the local, state, and federal levels. And so we wanted to develop new tools and technologies to engage more and more people in the process of advocacy at every level of government. And so one of the tools that we developed is this one, which is we call it our policy advocacy widget, which allows you to put in your zip code. It tells you who your state and federal representatives are, what issues they're currently considering related to this topic, and allows you to contact them all in 3 clicks or less. So we've had 81,000 people contact their state representatives through this tool. We also wanted to deepen our engagement. So we launched a survey called Stay Woke. It was a basic survey that asked people how many hours a week they had to contribute, what topic areas and projects they were interested in working on, whether it was data or policy or elections and campaigns or design and development, and then asked them what types of skills and experience do they bring to the work. And from there, we actually enrolled 16,000 people in 2 weeks. With those numbers of people, we began diving much deeper and being much more effective in our advocacy. It started with one project focused on police use of force policies. So as I said, the policies on how and when police use force vary tremendously between police departments. Here's a good example. So San Jose, the deadly force policy for San Jose, states that officers need not retreat or desist in the reasonable use of force. There is no requirement that officers use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive one. Contrast that with Philadelphia Police Department, which says the primary duty of all police officers is to preserve human life. Only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect life or to effect an arrest should be used by the officer. All lesser means of force, it says the application of deadly force is a measure to be employed only in the most extreme circumstances, and all lesser means of force have failed or could not reasonably be employed. Completely different standard, right? First standard says no requirement that an officer use lesser intrusive means of force. This one says an officer should only use deadly force after all other means are exhausted. So what we did was we recruited people from all across the country into a Slack group, and we began looking at the use of force policies of the 100 largest city police departments in America. Folks who, some people were students, some people might have been cashiers, everyday people, some people were policy experts, legal experts, all working together to actually find the use of force policies of their police departments, many of which were available online. For other ones, we did public records requests. Folks were reviewing those policies based on a set of criteria that we established in consultation with legal experts. And then our design and development folks were helping to visualize this information so that it could be accessible to people. And here's what we found. So at useofforceproject.org, we listed 81 of the 100 largest police departments which we were able to find information on. We visualized their use of force policies. For example, Minneapolis has 4 of the 8 policies that we identified as being important to restricting officers using force. But then we went a step further. We wanted to look at the connection between the use of force policies of these departments and the likelihood that they use deadly force. So what we found was that for each one of these types of policies identified, things like requiring officers to intervene if they see another officer using excessive force, requiring officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before using deadly force, having officers required to report every time they use force or threaten to use force, requiring de-escalation, requiring a warning before shooting, banning things like chokeholds and strangleholds. We looked at each of these categories. For each one, the departments that had these policies in place were less likely to kill people than the departments that did not. And when you combine it, we found that departments that have all 8 of these policies in place are 72% less likely to kill people than departments that have none of these policies in place. So the policies are associated with significant reductions in police use of deadly force. We also went a step further. So we were anticipating the response from folks who have been opposed to reforming the police. And so part of what I'm trying to say here is that what is important when you're doing data work for advocacy is always to be anticipating the type of critique or opposition from the other side of the aisle. Now, it's kind of easy in this space because there's sort of a script for this when you're talking about policing. When you're talking about policing, whenever you're trying to change use of force policies or impose a higher level of accountability, the opposition tends to come from the police union, and what the police union will say is that any type of restriction on the discretion of officers makes it harder for those officers to do their job and therefore increases the level of danger facing officers. It puts officers in harm's way and doesn't give them the tools needed to respond, which sounds like it kind of makes sense. But they never use any data, right, to support those narratives. In fact, there's never been a national study validating that perspective. And what we found here when we actually tested that proposition was that the police departments that have the most restrictive policies on use of force are actually the safest for officers. These are departments that have the fewest assaults on officers, the fewest officers being killed in the line of duty, and they also don't have significantly higher crime rates. So now I want to talk about advocacy. So data is important to identifying what's happening, to identifying solutions, but we have to design and develop tools to help empower communities to advocate for those solutions effectively and to hold their elected representatives accountable for effectively putting those solutions in place and getting results. And so what we've done across the country is partnered with communities to present this data. So in Orlando, Florida, for example, we presented the data on police killings, police use of force, stop and frisk, and we were able to effectively audit their use of force policies, their police union contracts, their civilian oversight policies, identify the specific issues in play, and work with communities to protest those issues, to make sure that the police department was being held accountable. We worked with the media to report on it. And sure enough, we actually saw the Orlando Police Department implement several of the use of force policy changes that were recommended. We also were involved in advocating at the federal level this past presidential election. So one of the things that was interesting was that the candidates, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or Governor O'Malley, they recognized during the primary that they very much needed to address this issue, but they were struggling to figure out exactly what types of policy recommendations would do so, in part because the evidence base around this issue is very thin. It's a very new field, and in many ways, criminology has been so focused on how to use policing as a strategy to address crime. They've never actually focused on how to actually prevent crime by police officers. And so what we did was we actually worked with all 3 of those campaigns to shape their policy agendas. So with Governor O'Malley, for example, when he was protested at Netroots Nation, he came to us and he said, how do we actually develop a platform that can address this issue? Because clearly, our candidate needs to show that he is committed to this given his remarks at that event. So we actually worked with their campaign to develop a platform very similar to Campaign Zero that they launched with. And we did a similar thing when we met with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton to push them to make sure that these items were within their agendas. The other thing that we did that was really effective was working at the local level to address every time a police union contract comes up for negotiation, every time a use of force policy is being reviewed, we now have a network where we're able to engage people in those communities and make sure that they are being mobilized to address that local issue. So one example is in Texas. In Texas, there is the Sandra Bland Act. Is being considered by Texas lawmakers. The Sandra Bland Act is in direct response to Sandra Bland's death and would include many types of provisions that would have potentially prevented that from occurring. Things like preventing police officers from arresting people based on a traffic infraction. Things that include higher accountability and effective and independent investigations in jails. And other types of things, different responses, mental health responders instead of police to these types of incidents. And so we worked with folks in Texas to actually identify all of the people that live within the particular jurisdiction of the committee members hearing that bill. And we work with them to mobilize them to engage those committee members to pass that bill. And so by scaling this work further, by reaching, we enrolled 16,000 people in 2 weeks. We got to 25,000 people shortly thereafter. And now we have about 70,000 people across the country who we are mobilizing whenever one of these policies comes up to take action. But that's just the beginning. There are 104 million Americans, according to Pew Survey research, who support the Black Lives Matter movement. If we talk about the broader sort of resistance movement that has emerged post-election, indeed, the majority of this country is angry and wants to do something about equity and social justice. But only a fraction of those people are actually engaged in the work. Every time I give a speech or I'm on a panel, people come up and say, what can I do to get involved? And that speaks to the fact that we're actually not being effective enough in engaging enough people in this work to have a transformational impact. What if we engaged 104 million people in the work? What does that look like? What types of tools and technologies could sustain that level of activism? Those are the questions that we need to answer as soon as possible, given the type of political climate that we're in and the urgent set of crises that continue to move across, that continue to be realized in our political environment. Just today, for example, news broke that the White House is considering and Congress is considering another go at the Affordable Care Act repeal, potentially on Wednesday or Thursday. So what does it mean to engage 100 million people in that work? I think what we've done is tried to pilot a program that can engage several thousand people across the country using new digital tools and technologies. I think Slack and other types of platforms like it have made it easier to get involved and have shown the potential to actually go much further than we have. So the challenge is for folks in this room, one, how do we actually make sure that our data work is embedded with equity and is drawing attention to the real equity challenges that we confront? In policing, it was clear that we needed to use data to help give voice to the very real concerns that communities have been feeling for a long time, but were being dismissed because the institutions failed to collect data on the issues that were confronting them. So in collecting the data, it has to be collected, reported, analyzed, and visualized in a way that allows community members and allows the broader public to understand what's going on, to understand that there are real equity challenges and that there are real solutions. And then we have to be using new tools and technologies to help empower people to implement those solutions, to hold their local, state, and federal elected officials accountable to implementing those solutions, and ultimately to track progress given results. So for example, when we launched this database in 2014, it was all very new. Now we actually have 4 years of data we're working with. So we are tracking in every city the trend line. Is this going up or down over time? As policies are being implemented, are they having their intended effect? These are things that for the first time we're able to actually start answering because we have the data. And so as data folks, as data viz folks, it is important to know that your work has tremendous equity implications. Not paying attention to equity can actually perpetuate inequities. But paying attention to equity, embedding it in your work, using visualization to draw attention to those disparities, to draw attention to those solutions, is actually the type of change work that we desperately need. It is the type of work that can make this work much more accessible than it has been. When you think about the way that advocacy work has been conducted in the past, oftentimes advocacy organizations will spend a lot of money to do a 30-page report on a problem that nobody reads. What we need to be thinking about is how do we actually communicate this topic in 10 seconds or less? Because most people don't have time to read a 30-page report. We have to be able to show this issue and communicate exactly what we're saying and what needs to be done in 10 seconds or less. It has to be responsive, it has to be visual, it has to be communicable via mediums like Twitter, like Snapchat, like Instagram. This is where a lot of people are. This is where the advocacy community has emerged and has been tremendously effective. So I'll close by just saying, I'm excited about the potential of the moment that we are in. Never before have so many people been activated and ready to do the work. Never before have we had the tools and technologies to effectively onboard them and engage them into the work to be impactful. The challenge is just to do it effectively, is to actually make sure that we are doing it in a way that is strategic, that is connecting people directly to the issues in their communities. So, we're not telling people to contact their congressman to address police violence, because police violence is predominantly a local and state issue. So we have to be really strategic in that as well. But again, I think this is a moment where we can go big, where we can actually have the transformational change. Because when you can mobilize millions of people, you can actually achieve an incredible amount of progress, and we're just starting to begin to see how that actually works on the ground. So that's all I have to say at the moment, but I'd love to take questions and dive deeper into the work. I know you all are data people, so I imagine that you have some data questions. So thank you.
Okay, lift hands, because obviously this is a big room, and I will try to get to you. I did warn Sam that this is a Minnesotan audience, and you might need
She did warn me.
Like a minute. And of course, hi, Mark. This is I feel, what? No. Oh, yeah. It's okay. I feel like I'm Frogger right now.
Hi. What are some of the data visualization tools that you found most effective in creating compelling visualizations to tell your story?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, getting started in the work, I was finding off-the-shelf solutions. We were moving very rapidly and didn't have a lot of capacity. So when you see the map there, that was CartoDB. We just literally took an Excel spreadsheet, uploaded it to CartoDB, and visualized it. The cool part about the site, about Carto, is that you can actually animate it over time. So when you see, if you go to mapandpoliceviolence.org, it is not a static image, it's actually a timeline. Which has a particular impact in terms of communicating the urgency of the issue. However, as we've evolved, I think D3 has been really, really important, and we're continuing to explore new tools and technologies to communicate the information a little bit more effectively. We're actually doing a redesign of the Mapping Police Violence site right now so that it is less image-based and more interactive. I would also say Tableau has been an incredible tool for us to be able to, the city and state comparisons are done via Tableau, and it's great to see, that it's interactive. You can click on it and see the details of each case. You can sort by particular characteristics in cities and states. So that has worked for us. I think there are actually, as you probably know, there are far more advanced tools that we could use, and so that's what we are starting to do with our redesign.
So there's the data that you had to hunt down. And I think in about 2 sentences, you convinced me that it was accurate and good, because I'm a supporter. So my question is, there's a lot of data that's not being collected. And trying to find that data and track that data down is really difficult. And then having it vetted. So how hard was that to do? How did you find the data? And how did you get it vetted?
Good question. So in terms of your first part of your question, how did we find the data? As I said, there were 2 databases that already had, I would say, about 80% of this information. The problem was nobody had merged those databases or filled in the gaps to actually be able to tell this story. So we took those 2 databases. We audited those databases ourselves. So we took a random, it was about, how many, about 400, we took 400 records for each database, randomly selected, and tested them to see if they were accurate. They were 100% accurate. From there, we merged those databases and filled in the gaps. So in terms of how to find other types of data to fill that in, that was through social media profiles of the person. That was through obituaries. So most people have a picture of themselves online somewhere. So we found those pictures, and that was how we were able to code racial identification for many of these. Of course, there are some ambiguities in that that are important to note. So we had to leave some of them unclear because of that. In terms of the second part of your question, there are many databases that have emerged actually since we've done this using a similar methodology. So like the Washington Post, the Guardian has created their own databases of police shootings. And so we are constantly working with them to cross-reference our work, right? So they do some reporting where they're finding information. They have far more resources than we do. So they oftentimes can find pieces of information that we can't, whether it is going directly to the police department and getting it, interviewing folks on the ground in those situations. And so we actually can borrow some of what we do from them, right? So if they've identified folks that we have yet to do that, we will incorporate that in our database. In terms of the accuracy of the database, this has been something that has been there's been a lot of debate over how accurate is crowdsourced data coming predominantly from local media reports in terms of police violence. 2 studies have come out that have spoken to that. The first was done by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And so they use a multiple systems analysis to basically show, they looked at the level of overlap between 2 official databases, and by doing that they were able to estimate the actual total universe of people killed by police. Their estimate was about 1,200 people are killed by police every year. The Bureau of Justice Statistics actually took up this work as well and looked at the local media reported police killings, which is what comprises our crowdsourced databases predominantly, and also followed up with police departments themselves to fill in any gaps. What they found, they looked at, I believe the period was from May to June 2015 to May 2016. And they found they estimated 1,200 people were killed by police between that time period. We have 1,201 in our database between that time period. So I don't think we have all the data. I think that there are going to be gaps in areas where there's not a large media presence. So in particular in rural areas, in Native American reservations, there will be gaps there, right? So I think it's important to note that. At the same time, we're very close to the total. So we're in the high 90s, and that's according to the best research estimates that have come out. But we're always interested in how we can find more and better data. I think that will require partnerships with folks in those rural areas that are able to identify that this is happening, even in places where media is not there or is not reporting on it. And so we're actually working on building some of those relationships to fill in those gaps as well.
Hi. My question has to do with smart cities. There was an IoT conference here last week, and there was a lot of interest in the smart city movement. And I'm curious about how we, as web developers and designers, can begin to advocate for increased transparency as those technologies are installed across our cities, so that we can empower the public who aren't working in technology to have access to that data. Like, how can we, as it's rolling out, make it as equitable as possible?
So just so I'm clear, you're working with cities to make their data sets publicly available?
I'm not. I'm curious about how we can advocate for that.
Right. In our work, that has happened through the White House Police Data Initiative, which we've been involved in. Now I think that whole initiative is sort of on hold. But it has been an effective initiative in terms of pushing for police departments to make some of their data available. And one of the ways that they've done that is simply by there are pros and cons, right? So on the one side, the way that they did it was by making it voluntary. They said that if you're a police department, you can upload any 2 data sets that involve either police behavior or crime, and they got a lot of uptick, right? A lot of police departments did that. The problem with oftentimes having cities voluntarily report their data is that they will report the data that makes them look good and not the data that doesn't. And that's what we saw was that police chiefs that were speaking about the initiative would say, we're telling our story through the data. We are using the data to defend our officers, which obviously they have a right to do. But what is important is to figure out, as a city will release data, are there ways of ensuring that equity is present in that data, that there are community narratives that are being represented, and are there gaps that cities need to comply with filling in order to actually make that data public? I think that's a huge question, right? So if a police department wants to only report data on, for example, police shootings that they ruled justified, right? They don't want to report data, for example, on whether it is like the racial disparities in that data, or whether the person or not was unarmed or armed. Then it's actually not very useful to have the data because you're not able to really tell what's going on. You're just going to get an aggregate number, but you're not going to be able to use it effectively to say, here are some of the policies that could be used to address it. So I think in terms of with cities, it's important to work with them to be able to figure out what type of data are they trying to release? Will releasing that data serve an equitable purpose? Or are there actually dimensions to that data that they are not releasing that they need to release? And then work with activists to make sure that data does get released. And I think it is something that changes depending on what field you're in. With our field, we have benefited by having a crowdsourced method by local media reports of getting this information that doesn't rely on police departments. The folks that are relying on police departments for their data oftentimes can't actually make their data public because of those contractual relationships. So it's something that you're going to have to navigate. I think my advice would just be to make sure that equity is centered in those conversations, that things are being released publicly, that if there is information on race, that it is being released, race and gender, and that if you are working with cities to release this type of data, that it's also individually identifiable. So another big challenge has been, officers involved. In 1 in 6 departments, they're actually prohibited from releasing the names of the officers involved. In another large portion of those, we actually have to use public records requests to get that information, which takes a long time and a lot of money. So try to make sure it can be as accountable as possible for you to identify what's going on, who's impacted, which communities are impacted, and who's responsible. I think with that type of information, you can be a really effective advocate for policy.
Hi there. I have 2 questions. My first question is, can you talk a little bit about your funding? And then the second question is, if we want to contact members of your network in our area, is there an easy way to do that, to be able to amplify messages?
Yeah. Yes. So in terms of funding, our work has been funded predominantly through individual donations, so small dollar donations. We have recently received a few grants, like smaller grants. Our total budget is about $125,000. We're not a large organization. In many ways, we're sort of a startup. In terms of how people can get involved. So the way that we have done it is by recruiting people through that survey intake process that I showed. And once people sign up, then we invite them into a Slack group where they are with other people in their state, as well as Slack groups by topic area or project area. So if you want to get connected to that, if you give me your email address or just sign up at staywoke.org is the survey, then you'll be invited into that group and you can share with those other folks there.
You had mentioned several websites over the course of your talk. I'm just wondering if you have a list of those. They sounded like really great resources.
Yeah, so our work, there are a couple of platforms that we launched. Mapping Police Violence is the data platform. It is information on the problem and where it's most acute. Campaign Zero is our policy solutions platform. That's at joincampaignzero.org. And then finally, within that, those 10 policy categories, we've done projects focused on a particular category. So we did one focused on use of force policies, which is at useofforceproject.org. And we've done one on police union contracts, which is at policeunioncontractproject.org. They're all interconnected, so if you go to one website, you can click through to the others. But those are some of the main websites. The last one is our volunteer engagement platform, which is Stay Woke.
Thank you. On the, I think it was the policy adoption slide, it displayed a slight uptick in police deaths after 3 or more policies were adopted, but a general decline as you got more policies adopted. Could you maybe speak to the data behind that uptick and how you are framing the discussion?
Are you referring to the chart on the left here? So there's not an uptick. It goes, so the right chart is actually officers killed in the line of duty. The left chart is policies, is police killings per capita. So you actually see with the departments that adopted more of these restrictive policies, it was a steady downward trajectory, as one would expect. Yeah.
I actually have a question since I have a microphone. So you are operating with a very small amount of funding and doing, I mean, I've watched this for the last few years evolve. How are you managing that sort of crowd volunteer stuff with such a small staff that I'm sure is also doing other work? Because, you know, $125,000 doesn't go very far for money.
Yeah, so I think our organizing model is different, right? It is, we believe that there are more than enough people in this country who care about this issue and want to donate some of their time to address it. Our challenge is not raising a lot of money so we can hire a lot of people. It is how do we leverage the potential that's already out there? And so that's what we've been trying to do, right? I think it has worked for us. I think over time, as we continue to grow, right, we will need more funding for example, like community managers to be able to manage those volunteers. So the structure of work involves people that are volunteers, but also people who are managing volunteers. And then I'm sort of managing the managers. And so it is sort of a structure that is developing, and as that continues down the road and we add more and more people to the work, there will be challenges around how do we actually scale the resources to be able to support those folks who are managing other folks. And I think, and we have some ideas about where we might be able to find that. But this has worked for us, and I think in many ways, you know, our organization has been successful because we have been a smaller organization. And that allows us to be very quick. So in terms of how we're actually doing this advocacy, and I guess this is another key lesson, is that you have to be able to operate in today's rapid-paced media environment to be effective. You could have the best research in the world, but if you don't drop that research when people are paying attention, nobody's going to listen to it. So, for example, when an incident happens, we are, you know, whether it is, let's say, you know, in Tennessee or whether it was in Baton Rouge, like immediately after that happens, in 10 to 20 minutes after that first gets reported, we will be immediately tweeting out statistics about it. So we will be tweeting out whether there are any patterns of police abuse. So in Baltimore, it was that every person who was killed by police since 2013 was a black man, right? So when Freddie Gray was killed, like that immediately helped to contextualize this as something that was bigger than one event. We have access to the use of force policies and all these other policies, so we're immediately auditing those policies. We know what to look for, we know how to compare them to others, and we're putting that information out there, you know, within minutes. And we are building, you know, for Baton Rouge, we created a custom site that includes all of those in one place to help people understand it. But all of this is happening, really it's out within the first hour of something happening. And the reason for that is that we want this information to be included in the media reports. So as the national media and local media starts to report on this issue, they need to understand that this is not just an isolated incident, that there is a whole there's a whole history of misconduct, oftentimes in these places, that needs to be addressed, that requires a systemic solution beyond indicting that one officer. And so our small organization has enabled us to move very quickly and do that without having to go through 10 different people before a product gets out.
Any other questions? Matt.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit with the use of force project and the union contract project. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you work, how you crowdsource that effort, and also sort of secondarily what you're planning on tackling next.
Yeah. So in terms of how we crowdsourced it, for the use of force, actually for both projects, one, we realized that this was an issue that was not getting a lot of coverage. People weren't paying attention as much to the use of force policies, or especially the police union contracts. We also knew that that this was an issue that there are 18,000 police departments in America. It would be impossible for us, as a small organization, to review all of those contracts. But we also have connections with folks and a network that can help. And so what we did was, depending on the person's sort of skill set, we helped place them in the work that worked for them. So for people who were like lawyers, folks who were policy experts, we created a Slack group where we were able to problem solve around the types of policies that we should be looking for within these documents. So the things like, does it require an officer to exhaust all other means before using deadly force? Or in the police union contract, does it actually erase an officer's misconduct record? Is there a provision for that? So with that Slack group, we actually worked around identifying the key provisions that folks thought were the most impactful, and also where there was some variation across police departments. And when I talk about lawyers and policy analysts, we're talking about former DOJ civil rights attorneys. We're talking people who have very high capacity and expertise in the area. With other folks, it was can you find this policy online, right? So a lot of people, particularly students, are adept at finding things online. You just have to tell them what to look for. And so we were saying, can you find the police use of force policies for these 5 police departments? More often than not, that's available online. Where those are not available, we do FOIA requests. And so there's a program called muckrock.com where you can very easily submit a Freedom of Information Act request to get that information. And so we submitted those requests to get, to fill out the rest of the information. So it really depended on skill set and what people were interested in doing. So you had highly skilled folks who were figuring out what to code these contracts for, who were reviewing the policies. You had everyday folks finding the policies online. We had designers and developers who were helping to design the graphic that you saw. And we also had folks who were academics who were helping to do the academic study that we launched along with the Use of Force project that proved that difference was statistically significant. So that's sort of the structure that we built around it.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you.